Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to welcome y'all to the first ever Latinx Education Summit. We have some great conversations for you these next 2 days as we collectively dream of a future where all of our kids in North Carolina thrive in our education system. Before getting started, I want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Elaine Townsend Utin, and I am the co-founder and executive director of LatinxEd. I am a proud Southern Latina with Peruvian roots, and I have dedicated my life to this pursuit of education equity in the South, especially here in North Carolina. For the last few years, I've been doing that in the context of Latinx Ed with my partner in leadership, Ricky Hurtado. Ricky, welcome to the stage.
Hey, folks. Good afternoon. First, Elaine, I got to give you a shout out. That was impeccable timing with the video and the song. I mean, we got to add DJ to the resume.
Thank you.
I'm the co-founder and director of advancement with LatinxEd. And in my spare time, moonlight as a legislator at the General Assembly here in North Carolina. So thrilled to be able to finally launch this virtual event and see this opportunity come to life as we have some critical conversations about the present and future of Latinx education in North Carolina. And so now that you've met us, I want to make sure I toss it back over to Elaine so she can introduce this event and what we're all about at LatinxEd. One quick announcement before we get started here is, as you see on our banner, we have simultaneous interpretation happening in Spanish. And so if you'd like to listen to this presentation in Spanish, just head on over to that link and you'll go into a Zoom room where you'll be able to listen to everything in Spanish. So Elaine, take us away.
Thank you, Ricky. We are so honored that you all have joined us in this virtual space. And in efforts to, Ricky mentioned in efforts to make this event accessible in English and Spanish, we are so grateful for our incredible interpreters who are also making magic happen in our Zoom. And we also hope you had an opportunity to connect on a one-on-one basis with other attendees prior to this session. And if you didn't, make sure to tune in tomorrow at 3 p.m. for more networking opportunities. We also have an incredible lineup of speakers for you across the span of the summit, from educators to parents to students, and we will be learning about the unique barriers and opportunities that the Latinx community is facing within North Carolina. Now, there is so much I could share about the mission and vision of LatinxEd.
Elaine, hold on. I know you have a lot to share, but you know I love birthdays, and today is our third birthday of LatinxEd. Who could have thought this is where we'd be 3 years from now? So I'm going to put this in the mail for you after this is done. So happy birthday.
First of all, it's our birthday. What? LatinxEd is officially a toddler now. And when we first began, we dreamed of creating an organization that truly met, our community where they are, and looks to expand educational equity for Latinx immigrant families across the state. And over those last 3 years, we've been busy, y'all. So I want to start off with talking about who we are. So LatinxEd invests in Latinx leadership, and in particular, we also work to expand educational equity and opportunity in North Carolina. We dream of a North Carolina where every community and school has a culturally sustaining environment that recognizes, meets, and honors the diverse needs of Latinx immigrant families. We have done this through a variety of programs. We've invested in building a community of students where they get to learn about their history, their culture, and identity as Latinos in the South through chapters and summer camps of our Somos Carolina program. We've invested in the leadership and voice of the youth leaders of tomorrow by recognizing and highlighting them through our Latinx 20 Under 20 competition, the only award in North Carolina that lifts up Latinx youth and their contributions to our community across the state. We've worked hard to expand pathways to opportunities after high school by helping Latinx students navigate the often challenging pathway for immigrant families through high school and into college with our College y Gonzales initiative, a virtual advising program that centers culture and community for our students across North Carolina. Of course, we've also been cultivating a community of education champions in the state by launching the LatinxEd Fellows, an opportunity for education leaders. And so, folks, if y'all are in the room, if you participated in any of these programs, we'd love to go ahead and drop us a little hello. We're so excited to have you and welcome you into this space as well. And we've done all this work while continuing to center the youth voices and allowing them to share their expertise of their lived experiences in North Carolina. So this is another really big opportunity for y'all, as well as that we have also been using storytelling as a vehicle for change, launching the Nuestro South podcast, which is for and by Latinx youth. Our work directly impacts Latinx youth and families across the Greater Triangle. That's a part of our past and present work. But as we look to our future, we have big plans to make sure that Latinx families from across North Carolina have their voices heard when it comes to their educational future. So I'm going to turn it over to Ricky to share a little bit more with you about what we have in store for this upcoming year.
Of course. That was quite a breakdown on all the work that we've been doing over the last few years. And all of that work really motivated us into where we're heading now in the next 12 months with some of our work. And I'm excited to share with that. But I think in this moment, it's important to continue to acknowledge the continued challenges that our community faces. COVID-19 has rocked all of our worlds and really impacting the health and wellness of every single person on this planet. We've had a racial reckoning that has really put us in a position as a community to begin asking difficult questions around racial equity really looks like in our community. And we've had disruptions in education from virtual learning to now in-person learning with new COVID-19 protocols that have left us with more questions than answers. And so we felt it appropriate that in this moment, we ask for imagination in community to really reimagine how we serve all of our students in North Carolina. And we especially know that this is necessary because in the last 18 months, this pandemic has impacted the Latinx community disproportionately than other communities when we think about the essential workers at the front lines and what that means for families and students growing up in our education system today. So as all this is happening, we also know that community has been thinking of ways to respond, and there's so much happening across the state. We as LatinxEd are learners and want to have an ear to the ground to make sure that we understand promising practices and understand the challenges and opportunities in our community. We felt it important to continue to communicate what was happening across North Carolina to the folks making decisions at the state level and local level as well. And so earlier this month, in conjunction with the direct services that we provide to our community every day, we launched a listening tour that we've named the Somos NC, or We Are NC Listening Tour, that will allow us over the next 12 months to travel across North Carolina, both virtually and in person, to listen and learn from students, from parents, from educators, and community leaders around what they see as the true challenges and opportunities in this moment and how we move forward to advance Latino student success across North Carolina. And so we thought, what better way to kick off a listening tour than to bring folks together to talk about the challenges and opportunities facing Latinx students in North Carolina. And so this Latinx Education Summit is all about that, centering the voices of those directly impacted and those at the front lines of the issues that we talk about every day. I don't know about y'all, but I'm often in rooms where we're talking about educators, about students, about parents, without them in the room having a voice in the conversation. And over the next 2 days, we're changing that, where we're giving them the microphone, we're giving them center stage, and allowing them to reflect with us around what they've experienced over the last 18 months and how we reimagine some of the more challenging issues we face in education. So we'll be hearing from students, from educators, from caregivers around what's been going on in their lives as we continue to think of new ways to move forward. We know that this conversation is as important as it's ever been. And that was underscored by the new census data that was just released earlier this year that really showed how North Carolina was changing. It came to no surprise to folks who do this work every day, who has been seeing this change firsthand in their communities across rural and urban North Carolina. We know now that the success of North Carolina over the next decade depends on the success of Latinx students and families in North Carolina as well. And so perhaps not all of you have taken a deep dive into the census data and wonked out a bit like we have to really understand what's going underneath the hood. But we thought it was an appropriate place to start this conversation today as we think about what the next 2 days hold in store. So we're thrilled to be able to join today with Dr. Rebecca Tippett to talk to us a little bit about updates on the census data, what this means for where the Latino community is at this moment, and how this impacts educational outcomes in North Carolina. She's the director of Carolina Demography, and I'm sure many of you have seen her traveling across the state, both in person and virtual, sharing this critical information to inform us on what's happening across North Carolina. So, Rebecca, we're so excited to welcome you to the stage today to share a little bit about what's going on in North Carolina and the state of education here for the Latinx community. So I will give you the stage and let you take us away.
Great. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here. So let me get this started. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what we know from the census, which for nerds like me was a really big, exciting opportunity for us to understand the North Carolina population. But we're also going to talk about the most recent data we have from other sources that tells us not just about the number of individuals in the Latinx community, but where they're from, what their identity is, and then focus specifically on the impacts in K-12 and that kind of education into post-secondary pipeline and what we know from a variety of data sources. Before I go into that, I want to share a little bit about what Carolina Demography is and what we do, because what we really do, what our organization represents is a group of individuals who work to answer the question, where is North Carolina heading? And we do that through a variety of ways, whether that's kind of custom data projects, custom population estimates and projections, written reports, or presentations. But I also want to let you know that we do a wide variety of just kind of general public service resources that are public facing, and we take questions at demography@unc.edu. That information is at the end of the slide. So you're always welcome to shoot us an email and ask about whether or not we have the information that you need for your community to understand kind of who you're serving. So just know that is a resource that you can turn into. So with that out of the way, first things I'm going to talk about today is what we know about the Hispanic or Latino population by the numbers. So this is just population totals, where that population is. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on the intersection of this population, then educational outcomes and what we know. And you may notice I mainly use census data, so I use the terms Hispanic or Latino quite a bit. I often tend to use them interchangeably with Latinx. So I'm probably going to cycle through all three of those terms today, just kind of from a federal statistical standpoint. It's a hard habit to break. So what we know right now is that as of 2020, the 2020 census, there were 1,118,596 Hispanic residents in North Carolina. That's actually a little more than we had thought there were going to be. So this, this has been tremendous population growth and is quite significant size in the state. This is looking at what it looked like from 1990 through 2020. So this is the most recent 4 decennial censuses. And in 1990, there were fewer than 77,000 Hispanic residents. And that was just 1.2% of North Carolina's population. That population grew substantially over the 1990s, reaching almost 380,000. Again, grew substantially between 2000 and 2010, reached almost 800,000. And now in 2020, over 1.1 million and 10.7% of North Carolina's population. So in 1990, about 1 in 100 residents was Hispanic or Latino. In 2020, we're talking about 1 in 9. This is a big shift in North Carolina's population, and numerically, that's a 15-fold increase. When we look at how this growth happened, so that over the past decade, North Carolina's Hispanic population grew by 40%. That's slightly less rapidly than we saw in some of the Dakotas, in Tennessee, Louisiana, and parts of the Northeast, but much faster than we saw at the national level, where the Hispanic population grew by 23%. So this population was the second fastest growing kind of major racial ethnic group after Asian in the state. We did see faster growth among multiracial and other race, but there's been some changes in some census questions and coding. So I want to focus on that compared to Asian. And when we look within the state, we can see that, okay, when we look at that 1.1 million, the majority of that Hispanic population is really heavily concentrated numerically in our urban areas. In fact, over 1 in 4 North Carolina Hispanic residents live in either Mecklenburg or Wake. You can also see that some of our other counties here, Durham, Guilford, and Forsyth, have more than 50,000 Latino residents. Those have all been pretty significant increases over the decade. Some of the other counties here in the darker shades of blue, you see the suburbs outside of those urban areas. So Cabarrus County and Union County outside of Mecklenburg, Johnson County outside of Wake. But note too that we also see Cumberland and Onslow County here because those communities have military installations. And we have a pretty high military participation rate among some of our state's Hispanic residents, particularly individuals of Puerto Rican descent. So that's where the number of individuals live. When we look at the percent of individuals, we see that there's a higher share in many rural counties, but also that the population percentage that identifies as Hispanic or Latino has increased in urban areas as well. So a few years back, we really saw that places like Sampson and Duplin, Greene, Montgomery, and Lee, kind of high agricultural communities, had some of the highest percentages of the Hispanic population. Now we're seeing that increasingly there are also really large increases in our urban areas. So you can see there in the darkest blue, Johnston County, Durham County, and Mecklenburg County all have more than 15% of their residents are Hispanic, which is more than the state average of about 11%. So again, we see that there are Hispanic residents everywhere in the state, really kind of not heavily concentrated, but we do see that there's particularly large groups in some communities, particularly Sampson, Duplin, and then in our urban areas. But again, the growth of the Hispanic population was pretty steady across all the state's counties over the decade. So this is kind of what we know about 2020. And now I'm going to turn away from the census and to a survey called the American Community Survey, which is also done by the US Census Bureau, but provides more detail on that population to help us understand what's going on. So when we look here, we're going to see data from 2006 through 2019. I'm going to show you the number of Latinx residents based on whether they are foreign born or US born. And note here that US born includes individuals born abroad to US parents. So here you can see that the number of foreign-born Hispanic residents increased kind of through the 2000s, but really plateaued in 2010 all the way through 2018 until it increased slightly again in 2019. Over the same period, we really had steady increases in the number of North Carolina Hispanics that were born in the United States. That became the majority of our Hispanic population in 2010. That's 52%. And in 2019, that's now 61%. So again, when we're talking about the growth of the Hispanic population in North Carolina, much of that growth has been because we've had births to, this is what demographers like me call natural increase. So you have births to individuals who are already living here, so second or third generation populations, or you have US born Latinx individuals moving here from other states. So that's really what's been fueling that growth. When we look at the way that North Carolina Hispanic residents identify, there is a lot of diversity here. In particular, the majority of individuals identify as being of Mexican ancestry or origin, but in North Carolina, that is lower than the national rate, which is over 60%. A high proportion of North Carolina Hispanics identify as Puerto Rican, Honduran, Salvadoran, and Guatemalan at levels that are slightly above the national share among all Hispanics. So know that there's a slightly higher share of Hispanic residents that identify as Central American in our state and Puerto Rican compared to the national average. When we look specifically at the foreign-born individuals, we can see these are the countries of birth for individuals who have moved here from other countries. So you see Mexico is the number one here, followed by Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. But after those, you start to see other countries, so some of the Caribbean and South American countries become represented. And before I move on to educational outcomes, I think, Ricky, we wanted to have a brief
there we are. Just trying to run off the backstage there for you. This is all really fascinating data, Dr. Tippett, and I'm wondering, especially with the changes in the trends with foreign born and the diversity of the Latinx community in North Carolina, what does this mean? Like, where are we headed as a state when it comes to the makeup of the community?
So one of the big things that we saw in the 2019 data was a slight and small but noticeable uptick in the number of individuals identifying as being from Central America, which was consistent with what we were hearing about, the migrant crisis on the border, and in particular, kind of migrants moving from Central American countries. We did see that in the data in North Carolina. We saw some corresponding shifts in the foreign-born population, as well as in some of the trends in the percentage of children that were U.S. born. So what that means is potentially, what we know though is that those impacts are not felt evenly across the state, that those populations did not kind of uniformly disperse across 100 counties and are more likely to be heavily concentrated in certain communities. So in those communities, there may be kind of a relatively new immigrant population that has less resources or less connections to kind of the community potentially than other immigrant groups or other individuals may have. We also know that those individuals tended to have relatively lower levels of educational attainment, which means that they're going to face more challenges potentially in navigating K-12, navigating that transition for their children from kind of secondary into post-secondary. So I think that those are really important to keep in mind, particularly if you're in one of those communities where that population increased. I also wanted to address one of the comments that is in the chat about whether or not these numbers include undocumented residents. We know that undocumented residents are less likely to want to fill out the census. They're less likely to want to fill out the American Community Survey. But all estimates that we have seen from the national data would suggest that in general, these capture the vast majority of undocumented residents. So that the coverage we estimate is about 90 to 95% of all the total population. There may be some slippage, and that may be more pronounced in some communities, and unfortunately we can't really understand that fully, but we do think that they're really highly accurate, or as accurate as we can get.
No, that's really helpful to know. That's one of the biggest questions we receive, and actually you beat me to it, because it is folks just assume that they're not counted because of the hesitancy in filling out the census or the American Community Survey. So that's really helpful to hear.
Yeah, I mean, the Census Bureau has ways of making us all count, even if we don't fill it out. Obviously, the best way is to get people to fill it out. I do think that there are some legitimate concerns about what the impact of COVID-19 was on the full count, because to the extent that there may have been migration flows disrupted, or some people going back to countries of origin because of COVID-19, or potentially having to use different methods of counting, there are some reasons to believe that there may be slightly higher undercounts in certain communities than there would have been in prior decades. Overall, we know that there was a greater undercount overall in the census. So one of the things that we want to pay attention to is, if some of your members are in communities that they feel got undercounted, is, reach out to us. We can't solve that problem for you, unfortunately. There are some ways to either try to get the Census Bureau to revise the count, or if we get more information about the nature of the potential undercount, to try to understand how to resolve data going forward so that people can better understand what's going on.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. And I'm sure as we're talking, people have a million questions popping up on their end. And so I want to encourage you to use the chat here in the comments to drop your questions, your comments, as Dr. Tippett continues with her presentation. We'll have a chance at the end to answer with some Q&A with things that pop up. We're going to dive into some educational data now as well. And so certainly want to hear what you all are thinking, and also respond as from your experience. And we have educators here, we have former educators, or even aspiring educators. We want to hear your experience too. And so does this data match up with what you see in the classroom? I see Dr. Tim here talk about the challenging the newness narrative and what somewhat the data says that despite sure there being an uptick with Central American students overall, right? Many of our students in the system have been here a while, and they're a second and third generation of kids, right? And so really great conversation already happening in the chat. I encourage you to continue doing that so we can reflect on what these numbers mean for our community. And with that, I'll let you keep going here, Dr. Tippett.
Great, thanks, Ricky. So yeah, I wanted to emphasize, now we're going to talk about education, turning to kind of a variety of data sources here. But what I want to show right now, so this is the racial ethnic composition of the North Carolina population by selected age groups, and this is from 2019.
Becky, you may need to share your slides.
Oh, it says I'm sharing.
There you are. We see them now.
Okay, thank you. So again, I wanted to note this is not yet the census data because they have the data by age is not yet released. So that will not be released until 2022. So we're using slightly different data here. But the big takeaway here is that while 1 in 9 North Carolinians is Hispanic, that share is 1 in 6 out of children 0 to 17. So as we were kind of talking about too, about the newness, for a while, this child population was predominantly second generation, but it's important to note that over the next decade, the child population will be increasingly third generation. So we're still going to have some first generation, some or 1.5 generation, and many second generation individuals in the child population because of the size of the Hispanic population, like I said, is now 1 in 9 North Carolinians. Many of these individuals have been here, they're born in the United States, they're now adults. And so I think it's important that we understand that same kind of language or the approach that we used over the past 2 decades for thinking about what this population growth meant is probably not as useful going forward, because increasingly there's going to be a lot of diversity within this population. So again, keeping in mind that we're still talking really big picture here, and the more we drill down to either specific origin groups, specific counties, there may be a lot of variation that as we go forward in the next decade will be important to understand. So again, big takeaway is that this is a large and growing share of the child population. And when we look at that numerically, that was almost 400,000 children in 2020. So this is the 2020 census. We know the number of children under 18 who are Hispanic. And then going back to the American Community Survey, 93% of those Hispanic children are US born, meaning that they are native born citizens, the vast majority of those children being born in North Carolina. So when we look though at our educational outcomes, so now we're shifting to data from DPI, what we know, and I'm looking here mainly at the high school into post-secondary pipeline. We know that Hispanic students compared to all students are less likely to complete high school on time. When we look at all racial ethnic groups, Hispanic students have the lowest on-time high school graduation rate, and this is the most current data. It's 5 percentage points lower than the overall rate. We also know that Hispanic those individuals who do graduate are less likely to report post-secondary intentions. So this is looking at the post-secondary intentions of North Carolina public high school graduates in the most recent school year, so those who graduated in the spring of 2021. And when we look at this, about 1 in 3 individuals overall said that they plan to enroll at the UNC system. That was only about 1 in 5 among North Carolina's Hispanic graduates. That's in part because our Hispanic graduates are much more likely to report intentions to enroll in the North Carolina community college system. So 36% of Hispanic graduates reported that intention compared to 30% statewide, and that was the highest share of any group. But they're generally less likely to report intentions to go to other post-secondary programs like four-year private institutions or out-of-state institutions, and significantly more likely to report intentions to go into non-post-secondary opportunities like work, the military, or here it's classified as other. I think this would predominantly be kind of home, caring for home, or kind of starting a family. And I want to emphasize here I'm not showing this data over time, but this has been a big shift since the pandemic. So we've seen it's about a 6 or 7 percentage point shift of our Hispanic students away from intentions to go to post-secondary and towards work and military. And that has predominantly come from individuals who used to say that they would be interested in going to community college and now are saying that they're interested in work, military, or other. So that has been a big shift statewide, and it's been particularly pronounced among our Hispanic students. When we look, so now we're back to data that unfortunately the most current I have is not that current. So we're hoping to update this in the next 6 months with some new data sharing agreements. So just know that this is from 2009 through 2016 high school graduates, and that we expect many of these patterns still hold, and we're looking to update this within the next year. But what we know is when we look at individuals who immediately enroll in a post-secondary program after graduation, high school graduation, more than half of all North Carolina high school graduates enroll in post-secondary, and that's less than 40% among our Hispanic graduates. So there's large discrepancies in on-time enrollment. And those discrepancies are wide across all of the state's prosperity zones. So you can see that across the state, it's a 25 percentage point differential between white students and Hispanic students in on-time post-secondary enrollment, but that those gaps are actually the largest in our urban areas. If we look at North Central, which is the triangle, that's where Raleigh-Durham area is, and then the Southwest region, which is Charlotte, as you can see in the parenthetical, those places have the largest gaps between white and Hispanic students, even though overall, many of those places have relatively high post-secondary enrollments. So it's important to note that if you live in a community that may look good on overall outcomes, sometimes those outcomes are masking some of the more significant equity issues in the state in terms of differences between economically advantaged and economically disadvantaged students. When we look at those students who do enroll, we see relatively high persistence rates among Hispanic students. So this is really important because when we're thinking about that post-secondary pipeline, for our Latino students, the big fall off is in the transition from high school into post-secondary. Once students are in post-secondary, they're very successful. They tend to stay, and they actually graduate at fairly high rates. This looks relatively low because it's 45% earn a degree or credential within 6 years compared to 51% of all students. But it's important to note that the majority of Hispanic students, or many more compared to other groups, go to 2-year programs where completion rates are much lower than students that start in 4-year programs. So when we account for some of the 2-year versus 4-year, you see very high completion rates among Hispanic students compared to some of their peer groups. So really important to note that for our Hispanic students, it's graduating from high school and actually making the transition that are the really big leaks in that post-secondary pipeline. So there's kind of 2 challenges that are really existing in navigating that pipeline. And the first is that the majority of our Hispanic children would be first generation in college. So this is looking at the highest level of parental attainment for North Carolina children in households. And when you look at this, you can see that for 31% of all children in North Carolina, the highest education that their parent has, or if they don't have a parent, their guardian has, is a high school diploma or less. But for our Hispanic children, that's the majority. 61% live in a household where the highest attainment of the adult head is high school or less. And if we go to the next level and say, okay, they've been to college, but they've been to college, so they have some college, but they don't have a degree, that share increases to about half of North Carolina children, and 75% live in a house. 75% of Hispanic children live in a household where no adult has a post-secondary degree. So this is really challenging because it means that they're less able to understand how exactly you navigate that pathway because their parents have not also walked that pathway. And you can see that those values are very different for our state's Asian and white students. The other challenge is that many Hispanic students live in households where their parents have limited English speaking ability. So limited English ability is defined as speaking English less than very well. And so you can see here, this is all those that have limited English. In 2019, 4% of Hispanic children had parents who did not speak English, 16% had parents who spoke English but not well, and 21% spoke well. And I want to note here that this is an increase over what it was in 2018, which goes to that increase in the Central American immigrant population that I talked about earlier. We see that about 1 in 3 children live in a household where parents speak English very well, and about 27% live in a household where parents speak only English. So again, this highlights that growing diversity among the Hispanic population. So just because we have a large Hispanic school population in a school does not necessarily mean that their parents are going to have trouble communicating in English. But for some of these children, their parents not only may have trouble communicating in English, their parents may also have limited literacy capacity because of their educational attainment, meaning that their children are then navigating a lot of the paperwork in that school environment. So this is what we know about the Hispanic population. I did say that, you can always get in touch with us. You reach out by email, but now I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully answer any questions that you have.
Great. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that thorough, in-depth overview on really important data here in North Carolina. We have a question here from Kevin Smith, and I'm not sure if you're the best person to answer this, but we certainly want to give a shout out to the audience if anyone from My Future NC is here and wants to perhaps provide some insight in how they're thinking about this. Certainly would invite them to jump in the chat. But I do think Kevin's question around one of the data points that I think was really alarming that you've shared around the post-secondary intentions and how COVID-19 has impacted that, especially among the Latinx community. And so if we are seeing a 6% to 7% drop in those intentions, and we're seeing a lot of that population being cannibalized from the community college system, like what does that mean for our My Future NC goals and in general the workforce in North Carolina? And so I don't know if you want to comment on that or just in general on the data once more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some real concerns here, and this speaks to why we're so interested in getting that updated data. And so the Department of Public Instruction and My Future NC are actually working to obtain updated data from the National Student Clearinghouse, which is, it's great to know student intentions. It's great to know overall enrollment at the community colleges. But what we really want to be able to do is say, well, what actually happened to those students? And that data will help us track that. And I know one of the questions I have is how much of this is really about, like right now we're using race and ethnicity as really crude proxies for social class and social status, really. And what we mean when we use a lot of these is we mean income, right? And and kind of parental education. And so what we want to see is it could be, we've always had a gap between students who said they wanted to go to post-secondary and then didn't attend. So it could be that there's more, not truthfulness, but potentially that those who maybe had aspirations that were not going to be enacted are now more realistically reporting what they're going to do. But I think it also is likely what we see is among particularly low-income students, a real downturn in post-secondary enrollment, which suggests, which has really long-term ramifications, not just like you said, for our state's labor force and overall preparedness and ability for us to, fill jobs that are being vacated by retiring baby boomers, but also for income inequality. Right. So if we're seeing that we know that wage returns for college education have been increasing, unemployment rates are lower. And if we see that people who are coming from higher income backgrounds are also then increasingly more likely to go to college, increasingly more likely to graduate from college, that just makes those gaps even wider.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. There was a second point you made here right after the conversation around intentions that really grabbed my attention, which was around your broader point around the danger of masking the true outcomes in our community by just looking at top level data, right? And so you were able, and one of the reasons I love your presentations is the visuals are so visual. You can see what's happening with the data. And so in the frame around post-secondary enrollment and the gaps being so pronounced between Hispanic or Latino students and white students, you saw that being especially true in more urban areas. And so this is more of a comment than a question, but I think it just underlines, especially in this conversation around how we really think about education equity, so much of it is in the data, right? Like you can't tackle a problem if you can't see it, right? And I think that many times we're not looking at data in the way you just presented it that allows us to see those pronounced differences in our community. I didn't know this, right? I do this work every day, and I didn't realize that the gaps were much bigger in places like the Triangle than other parts of the community. I know you're a demographer by practice, but you always get these questions around, well, the why, right? Why is this data the way it is? So I'm going to make the same mistake that everybody else always does in the audience and ask you, do you have any theories here or any comments around why it might be more pronounced in those areas versus other parts of North Carolina?
Well, I mean, I do have some theories, so know that I have not tested these theories. But we've actually seen some literature suggesting that really affluent, high-performing places like Berkeley, California, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, have these great overall outcomes, and then they have some of the largest disparities between affluent, like kind of non-economically disadvantaged students and economically disadvantaged students. And some of that really, I think, is that when you have when you have relatively kind of upper middle class, highly educated parents being a dominant portion, there are a lot of external activities that become kind of part and parcel of participating in K-12 education, right? And so some of the articles that I've read speak to this, like, it's not just enough to be in band, but you have to have private lessons, to play the instrument. And so it means that there's some of these activities that in a kind of less affluent area, maybe more within reach of everybody, right, become kind of stratifying mechanisms because they just don't feel available. I'm poorly paraphrasing like a fairly interesting piece of research, but I think there's probably some level of that going on, or I would be surprised if there's not. I also, one of the other things that's sticking out to me, as before the show we were talking kind of in the backstage about what's changing, and I've now been doing this presentation or talking about this for a few years. And one of the things that's becoming really evident to me is that much like the Asian community in North Carolina, we really need to start talking about the various Hispanic communities right within North Carolina. Because when we're talking about, I think often if I'm going out and talking to people, they may be thinking first generation immigrant, and that's not really the children they're seeing in school. But now, I think Ricky, you and I are talking previously, like if you got something in Spanish predominantly because they assumed that, you yourself need Spanish language communication, it's a little bit like we need some nuance in how we're thinking about these populations and whether or not they're the same in all communities. Much like we see those conversations need to occur when we're talking about the Asian community in the state. And I don't know that we really have had those conversations in a really public forum yet.
No. And thank you for lifting that up. It is certainly one of our favorite taglines here, LatinxEd, that the Latino community is not a monolith, right? And different experiences, incredible diversity. Your bar graph certainly showed that around, sure, predominantly Mexican, but we see a growing Central American community, a growing Puerto Rican community, and really talk to the different lived experiences of each of those communities. And so certainly plural when we talk about the Latinx communities, right? That's a really good point to lift up. Here's a few more questions for you, Rebecca. There's one here around the racial identity of Latinx people in North Carolina. We know that in the latest census, there was a growing share of Latinos that did not identify as white. And we can get into all the reasons as to why that shifted, right? Including how we ask those questions. But what do we know about the racial identity or self-reporting racial identity of Latinos in North Carolina? Did we see that shift tremendously in North Carolina in the same way we did across the country?
I wish I had a really good answer for that, and I have not looked at that data in enough detail to answer that. I know that we did see there was a great NPR piece by Hansi Lo Wang. So again, census nerds out there, if you want to really like dig deep, Hansi Lo Wang is the person to follow on all the nitty gritty, who really kind of went into that more generally. I have not looked at that in North Carolina. I think again we can talk about some of the some of the broader kind of public sentiment conversations, some of the prior administration, how that came out, but then also the question wording may have played a choice. I don't know whether or not it's because there's a shift fully away from white or potentially towards multiracial is also another thing that we may be seeing.
Yeah, no, a great point. Mark here just has a comment around the SAT and SAT requirements, and now that a lot of post-secondary education institutions are omitting, are no longer requiring them, right? And so admissions are seeing more diverse applicants as a result of this. Not a much you can comment on that, I don't think, but I'm curious on whether that's come across in your work. I've thought about it from a data perspective, as and I don't know how much you depend on SAT and ACT data, but we are seeing more universities and colleges make the decision to make this optional or not required it at all. And I wonder on I guess if you have a take on what this means in terms of new ways for us to really track and think about the outcomes for our students in high school and in college.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, admissions data, I have lots of like data treasure troves I'd love to get my hands on. Admissions data, application and enrollment data being one of them. But I do think a potential monitoring thing could be that as we monitor annual kind of enrollments, is if we see an uptick of enrollments, if there's kind of a change in the entering class at those schools that waives those requirements, right? Of whether we can see, I think UNC system has some dashboards that do kind of applications and enrollments. I don't know if they do those entirely by race and ethnicity, but one thing would be if we're seeing students kind of, whether that's at a school system level, if you know as a counselor, like where your students are applying, if you see shifts there. But more broadly, I would be wanting to look at those schools that are waiving those applications and seeing if we're seeing an actual shift in who's attending. Mm-hmm. And then more importantly, what we want to know is that those students who attend ideally have the same quality outcomes as the students who attended previously.
Yeah, no, great point. Y'all heard Dr. Tippett, y'all. If you want this analysis, go get her that data. So go send her those data sets so she can start crunching those numbers. And so no, that is a really helpful, I think, note to end on, and on just thinking about how we can continue using this data, how it helps us understand the past, present, and the future, and how nuances in the data are really important as we continue to advance this conversation around education equity. And so I certainly know that every time I hear one of these presentations, it certainly underscores our why as to why we're doing what we're doing, targeted solutions to targeted problems. And I think that's what equity is about when we're thinking about how we begin talking about some of these problems. And so really want to thank you for your time, Dr. Tippett. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, so we'll let you go here a little early. But if folks want to get in touch with you, is there a helpful way for folks to reach out to Carolina Demography in case they're interested in collaborating or anything like that?
Yeah, and I just dropped the email in the chat. So you can always reach out to us at demography@unc.edu. Definitely, that's the best way if you have questions or curious about some data stuff. Otherwise, I would be remiss. My communications director would be very upset if I did not mention we have a newsletter. You can always subscribe to that. And if you want to do any of that, check out our blog. You can look at ncdemography.org.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much, Rebecca. This has been a pleasure. Always nice to chat with you. And we will continue this conversation here at the next panel. So hope folks stick around here. We will have about a 10-minute break. But once we come back to the stage, we'll have a group of educators from all across North Carolina join us for a conversation around the impact of COVID-19, representation in the classroom, and what this all means for the future of North Carolina schools. So hope you stick around and listen to this next hour of our conversation as we continue the Latinx Education Summit.